Welcome to this explainer. Look, today we're not just going to flip through a history book or list off a bunch of dates. We're going to completely immerse ourselves in the suffocating heat and the ticking clocks of August 1947. This was an absolute crucible of human decision-making. Imagine the immense weight of a dying empire pressing down on a fractured subcontinent. It's a story where the fate of millions literally hung in the balance, and where the outcomes we all just take for granted today, they were anything but inevitable.
So, when you picture the end of the British Raj, you probably imagine the polished halls of political negotiation in Delhi or London, right? But the true catalyst for the empire's collapse actually began incredibly far from those corridors of power. To really understand what shattered the illusion of British control, we have to plunge into the gritty, industrial, and sweltering reality of Bombay's military ports. It all started with a staggering breaking point in the colonial contract. This wildly racist insult, hurled by British commander F.W. King in February 1946 at the Indian ratings on the training ship HMIS Talwar, was the spark. It ignited the Royal Indian Navy mutiny. You see, after years of post-WW2 exhaustion, starvation wages, and just systemic humiliation, this single insult acted as a massive powder keg, drastically accelerating the empire's exit.
Section 1. The Spark of Mutiny. The Royal Indian Navy Revolt of 1946. For centuries, the British Empire rested on one absolutely foundational pillar, the unshakable loyalty of its armed forces. Well, in 1946, that pillar violently shattered. Over 10,000 sailors across 56 ships and 20 shore establishments rose up. They tore down British ensigns, boldly renamed their force the Indian National Navy, and raised the flags of the Congress, the Muslim League, and the Communist Party all side by side. Imagine the sheer psychological terror this caused in London, that sudden, terrifying realization that the gun barrels were finally turning around. What's wild is how this mutiny masterfully blended immediate, practical military grievances with sweeping anti-imperial aspirations. Sure, the Naval Strike Committee demanded equal pay and an end to racial discrimination, but they went way farther. They demanded the release of Indian National Army prisoners and the withdrawal of Indian troops from Indonesia. And there's a fascinating historical irony here. While the political leadership in Delhi was deeply fractured, the naval sailors displayed this incredible, unprecedented unity. The message to the crown was undeniable. The military instrument of colonial rule was permanently broken. Section 2. The Hasty Departure. The collapse of unity, and the rush to partition. Okay, so with the military fractured, the political machine went into a completely panicked overdrive. The dream of a united India collapsed in a matter of months. Back in May 1946, the British cabinet mission had proposed a three-tier federation to keep India united. But by August, political deadlock triggered Direct Action Day, unraveling decades of the independence struggle into terrifying waves of communal bloodshed. Fast forward just a few months to June 1947, and the Mountbatten Plan officially accepted the agonizing partition of the subcontinent. What we're really looking at here is a fatal ideological collision of two defining visions. On one hand, you have the Indian National Congress, led by Jawaharlal Nehru, envisioning a mighty, centralized, industrialized modern state, demanding that provinces have the right to opt out of groupings. On the other hand, Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the Muslim League had this unyielding demand for the compulsory grouping of provinces as a sovereign safeguard against majoritarianism. Neither side was going to blink. This catastrophic ideological clash torpedoed any hope of compromise, making partition a tragic inevitability. 5. That's it. 5 weeks. That staggering number represents one of the most reckless geopolitical gambles in history. 5 weeks is all the time British jurist Cyril Radcliffe was given to draw a line dividing 88 million people and 175,000 square miles of territory in Punjab and Bengal. Sweating it out in the claustrophobic heat of a Delhi summer, armed with nothing but out-of-date maps and literally zero prior knowledge of the geography or people of South Asia, Radcliffe was tasked with severing a civilization in a matter of days. Section 3. A Tryst with Destiny. The Midnight Transfer of Power. While Radcliffe was toiling away in isolation with his deadlocked judges, the clock struck midnight on August 15, 1947. Inside the Constituent Assembly, Jawaharlal Nehru delivered these immortal words. The surreal contrast is just breathtaking, isn't it? You have this poetic, soaring idealism inside the halls of the Assembly, capturing this monumental achievement of wresting freedom from an empire, standing in absolute stark contrast against the bloody reality waiting just outside those doors. S. Radhakrishna echoed this profound reverence, really framing the geopolitical significance for a watching world. The transfer of authority in India stood as a historic beacon of hope. Think about it. When you weigh it against the bloody revolutions of iron and steel that brought Napoleon, Lenin, or Hitler to power, a negotiated, democratic transfer of power for hundreds of millions of people was nothing short of miraculous. But in a really cruel twist of historical irony, that midnight triumph was immediately undercut. To avoid ruining the independence celebrations, and honestly, to ensure the British could exit without dealing with the immediate fallout, the colonial government deliberately delayed the publication of the maps. When the Radcliffe Line was finally revealed on August 17th, it completely shattered the joy of independence. Millions in the border districts were plunged into immediate terror, totally unsure of which country they even belonged to. Section 4. The Long Shadow. The Tragic Fallout of the Radcliffe Line. So we move from the soaring rhetoric of Delhi to the devastating, visceral reality on the ground. Between 12 and 20 million human beings were violently displaced across the new borders in Punjab and Bengal. Let that sink in for a second. It was an apocalyptic scene of endless caravans and severed communities. To this day, this remains the largest mass migration in human history not caused by war or famine. It permanently altered the demographic fabric of South Asia and left up to 2 million dead in its wake. The newly born state was instantly thrust into a humanitarian apocalypse. Lawmakers had to desperately invent legislation on the fly just to keep millions from starving in makeshift camps. They were drafting emergency property and resettlement laws, creating custodians for abandoned property, and extending legal limits for traumatized refugees who had literally lost everything. The government was essentially building the foundation of a modern state while simultaneously trying to save its people from total annihilation. Section 5. Uniting the Fragments. The integration of 565 princely states. Now, while the borders were burning in the north and east, a second massive existential threat was looming: the potential balkanization of 565 princely states. Their British suzerainty had just suddenly terminated. Enter bureaucrat VP Menon. The guy was an absolute master tactician. He used intense psychological leverage, offering highly calculated concessions, like protecting royal egos, guaranteeing British honors, and offering exemptions from customs, all in exchange for absolute territorial control. Menon expertly convinced monarchs to accede, slowly walking a fragmented subcontinent back from the brink of total chaos. Section 6. The Hidden Architects. Forging a Constitution. All right, so as the physical territory was desperately being consolidated, the assembly faced an equally monumental task: forging a democratic republic out of a deeply traumatized and intensely hierarchical society. The moral anchor for all of this was the Objectives Resolution. Moved by Nehru in 1946, it was this radical, utopian promise delivered during a time of extreme darkness. It guaranteed social, economic, and political justice, promising to wipe every tear from every eye, even as violence raged just outside the assembly walls. And that radical promise of equality, it was fiercely driven by 15 heavily overlooked architects, the female members of the assembly. They weren't just making polite suggestions, they were fundamentally re-engineering a millennia-old social order. Hansaji Raj Mehta demanded absolute gender equality. Dakshiani Valyudan, the sole Dalit woman, fiercely championed the abolition of untouchability. Begum Kuzia Azaz Rasul opposed separate electorates to cement a secular state, and Durgabai Deshmukh embedded free legal aid right into the nation's DNA. So, as we wrap up this explainer, we really have to confront the immense intertwined legacy of 1947. We have the sheer, raw trauma of the Radcliffe Line, drawn in 5 frantic weeks, standing in stark contrast to the visionary, meticulously debated idealism of the Constitution. And the question we have to leave you with is this: how do those hurried, bleeding borders and the profound legal frameworks born in that crucible of chaos continue to drive every single modern geopolitical crisis in South Asia today? From border skirmishes to constitutional debates over secularism, it cast a chilling, unresolved shadow over the present day. Thank you so much for watching.